Thank you, Allie, and thank you for having me here today to deliver this presentation. I'm really grateful for this opportunity. The landscape of Alzheimer's and dementia research is quite robust and broad, and frankly, an hour is hard to cover everything. So please know that this presentation, I hope, is just a start of your own inquiry and understanding of Alzheimer's and dementia research. As Allie said in my introduction, which it's always awkward to have someone read your biography with you in the room, I am a gerontologist by education and practice. And so I am much more academically prepared in the social sciences, and much of the Alzheimer's research is around the hard sciences. However, in my role as research champion, I do receive monthly trainings with our home office medical and scientific team to be able to deliver this presentation and get you the information on this important topic. But please know, I'm certainly not an expertise in every area of Alzheimer's and dementia research, but I sure hope that today just starts your appetite for this topic. Next slide, please, Wendy. If you're unfamiliar with the Alzheimer's Association, we are a national nonprofit with really strong local presence. So Angel Hoffman is our director of Northern Colorado, and she works out of our office in Fort Collins. And through them and through our office there, through Angel and our office there, we have had a strong relationship with CSU and the Columbine Center of Healthy Aging. But nationally, we all have the same mission, which is our mission is to lead the way to end Alzheimer's and all other dementia by accelerating global research, driving risk reduction and early detection, and maximizing quality care and support. So not only does the Alzheimer's Association play a very important role in the global landscape of Alzheimer's and dementia research, we also play a critical role in the care and support that people living with dementia and their family caregivers need along the way until our vision is accomplished, which is a world without Alzheimer's disease and all other dementias. But until we're there, we're certainly still there for the caregivers and the people living with dementia who need us. An interesting fact about our logo, you see here that our logo that is on nearly everything with the Alzheimer's Association brand encompasses both our priority focus to people first and then science. And so our logo represents a human head alongside a beaker. So just a little fun fact about our logo today to hopefully give you a little bit of remembrance of what our mission and our work entails. Next slide, please. So as I said earlier, it's certainly difficult to cover everything related to Alzheimer's and dementia research in an hour. Alzheimer's disease and other forms of dementia are very, very complex. But our time today will be spent to give you a general landscape of Alzheimer's and dementia science. We'll talk about the role that the Alzheimer's Association plays in the science alongside institutes like the National Institute on Aging and the National Institute on Health. We'll talk about new highlights in early detection and diagnosis of the disease. We'll also talk about latest advances in clinical trials, treatments, and what we're learning about lifestyle factors and interventions that can possibly reduce risk. And last but not least, we'll talk about how you, as just a general community member or even a scientist, can get involved with the Alzheimer's Association's work on Alzheimer's and dementia research. Next slide, please. Each year, the Alzheimer's Association releases a very thorough facts and figures report. The facts and figures report is both from an epidemiology perspective and a demography perspective, getting current information on data related to Alzheimer's, other dementias, and also caregiving. The Facts and Figures report that was released earlier this year showed us that more than 6 million Americans are living with Alzheimer's disease, and over 11 million Americans are providing unpaid care to them. So this is a disease that not only affects the person with it, but more acutely affects those around them, their family, friends, and neighbors, who often have to take time off work, give up their own life priorities to step in and provide care to the person with the disease. As I said, these are unpaid family caregivers, so the Alzheimer's Association estimates that they provide about 15.3 billion hours of care annually that would otherwise cost the country $257 billion. This does not take into account the Medicare, Medicaid, VA benefit, and private pay money that goes into Alzheimer's and dementia care. The Facts and Figures report this year had an important secondary report on race and ethnicity in Alzheimer's and dementia research. It showed that discrimination is a pretty significant barrier to people of color, such as Black Americans, Native Americans, Asian Americans, and Hispanic Americans in seeking healthcare. And you can see those figures on the screen here. We know that Alzheimer's and dementia deaths have actually increased 16% during the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, you're probably asking yourself, is that because of people dying from COVID? And it isn't necessarily because of that. It's because of the isolation, the emotional trauma, and just the general effect of the pandemic on people living with dementia that led to that increase in death. Bringing it down to a smaller scale, we see that about 1 in 3 older adults dies with some form of Alzheimer's or another form of dementia. Next slide, please. It's important to ask ourselves if Alzheimer's affects everyone equally or the same. Over time, there has been a number of studies done to understand the gender, racial, and ethnic disparities in Alzheimer's disease prevalence, but then also in clinical trials. It's found that almost 2/3 of Americans with Alzheimer's are women. For many years, we thought it was because women tend to live longer. And so as they live longer, their age goes up and therefore their risk of developing Alzheimer's goes up. But more recent studies are showing that there actually could be biological or environmental or lifestyle factors in women that lead to that increased prevalence. We also see that older Black and Hispanic Americans are disproportionately more likely than older white Americans to have Alzheimer's and other dementias, 2 times and 1.5 times likely respectively. And again, studies are looking to see what could be unique about those racial and ethnic groups that lead to this increased prevalence. It's also important to note here that people of color and diverse participants have been historically underrepresented in clinical studies and clinical trials. And so this raises the necessity to really advocate for a more diversity in dementia research. Because if people of color or women or otherwise diverse populations are affected at a higher rate with Alzheimer's and other forms of dementia, it's important that the clinical studies and clinical trials being done to find a cure or a treatment or a known preventative measure include those populations as well. Next slide, please. Now, I know everyone comes to programs like this with a different foundation of knowledge. So I'd like to get us all on the same page in terminology. You've probably wondered, well, what's the difference between Alzheimer's and dementia? And you may have heard me reference Alzheimer's disease and other forms of dementia. So again, we're going to start with some terminology. Dementia is simply a syndrome, an umbrella term used to describe a range of symptoms. Symptoms that can include changes in one's memory, thinking, reasoning, learning, navigation, personality. And it is considered dementia when the changes are severe enough to interfere with one's ability to lead their normal life. So they start having issues in dressing themselves, feeding themselves, taking medications, handling finances, driving, managing medications. Dementia can cause a number of cognitive, behavioral, and psychological symptoms. And those symptoms really do look different depending on what causes the dementia. Alzheimer's disease is a disease of the brain. So that is the biological process happening in the brain that causes 60 to 80% of all cases of dementia. So I say when Alzheimer's disease is the cause of dementia, I say to families, Alzheimer's disease is what's occurring in the brain. Dementia is what you're observing in their changes. Other common causes of dementia include vascular dementia, dementia with Lewy bodies, and frontotemporal dementia. And again, each dementia causes different symptoms to occur earlier in the disease process. So whereas significant short-term memory loss and issues with planning and reasoning are common symptoms in early stage Alzheimer's, issues in judgment and language may be more pronounced early in diseases like Lewy body dementia and frontotemporal dementia. Some causes of cognitive decline aren't truly dementia, but are otherwise reversible. Things like medication interactions, alcohol abuse, poor diet and nutrition, sleep apnea can cause someone's brain to dysfunction enough to look like dementia, but there's some other medical issue going on that is leading to that decline that can be treated, and the decline can reverse somewhat. Next slide, please. In recent years, we have learned more and more about dementia, and we have started to understand it as a continuum. So we're understanding the cognitive impairment associated with dementia as more of a continuum that can span many years. Wendy, can you press just next one more time? Because I think that will populate the rest of the slide. There we go. And it might be 3 times because I think there's some text. Oh, nope, just go back. I was wrong. Just twice then. Thank you. With this continuum of dementia that can occur across many years, we're finding almost pre-dementia stages. You may have heard of the term MCI, or mild cognitive impairment. We know that MCI is a known risk factor for dementia, and everyone who eventually develops dementia would have gone through the MCI stage, but not necessarily everyone with MCI will develop dementia. Understanding dementia as a continuum gives scientists and clinicians an earlier part of the disease process to target therapies of intervention to change the course of the disease before it comes to the point of dementia. So if we ever get to a point of being able to prevent cases of MCI, we can say that we are also preventing eventually new cases of dementia. So thinking of dementia as a continuum moves people through being cognitively unimpaired, having mild cognitive impairment where the impairment is detectable, but their activities of daily living are not yet affected. And then we have the 3 stages commonly associated with dementia: mild dementia, moderate, and severe, or early, middle, and late stage, like we like to call it at the Alzheimer's Association. Next slide, please. In understanding Alzheimer's disease, even in thinking of that continuum of dementia that we just talked about, it's important to understand the hallmarks of Alzheimer's disease. These hallmarks were first discovered back in 1906 by Dr. Alois Alzheimer's, who discovered this biology in the patient he was looking at, whose name is Augusta de Terre, who found that these extra deposits of beta amyloid were developing on the neurons and tau tangles were developing inside of them, causing dysfunction in the brain. When these plaques and tangles see abnormal buildup, the brain isn't able to function as it once was. And over time, we see actually atrophy or death of neurons and brain shrinkage. So you can see here on the right what a normal brain would look like, or a healthy brain, I rather should say, and a brain that has been affected by an abnormal buildup of those plaques and tangles, causing the neurons to dysfunction and eventually die, and we see that atrophy in the brain. So understanding the very basic biological and pathological hallmarks of Alzheimer's disease allows us to think of even the ability to expand that continuum further. We know that these hallmarks of Alzheimer's disease may be present in the brain 20 years before the onset of dementia symptoms. So again, that gives us that perspective of the continuum of dementia and a potential earlier target of intervention. Next slide, please. Historically, Alzheimer's has been thought of as a part of the normal aging process. It's been thought of almost as wrinkles and gray hair, two things that are somewhat inevitable with growing older. And that's where we get terms like senile dementia or old timers. People associate aging with Alzheimer's disease dementia. It's really important to differentiate normal cognitive aging and aging with dementia that looks different due to disease. So we say here that Alzheimer's is not a normal part of aging. And when we study dementia risk is understood and studied from two main angles. Those non-modifiable risk factors, things we can't change, and the modifiable risk factors, things that we can change. So Wendy, I think if you press once more, the risk factors should populate in that circle. So age and increased age is the #1 risk factor associated with Alzheimer's disease dementia. Each year that someone gets older, their risk of many things does go up, including dementia caused by Alzheimer's disease. There is a genetic component to Alzheimer's disease, and there are two categories of genes. Deterministic genes, that if someone has those genes, it's 99% likely they will develop Alzheimer's disease. Don't worry, if you had one of these deterministic genes, it's highly likely that you would already be enrolled in a clinical study or a clinical trial. They're very rare, but they're powerful tools because they give us a population of people in research studies and clinical trials where we know disease will be present. And so it gives investigators and clinicians earlier opportunity for intervention. The other category of genes include risk genes. And that's when our APOE gene comes into play. Everyone has two types, or two counterparts, if you will, of the APOE gene. And having an APOE4 variation, or two of them, does put someone at a higher likelihood of developing Alzheimer's disease dementia. Conversely to that, there are other types of the APOE gene that are associated with lower risk in developing Alzheimer's disease dementia. So they're not definite answers, but they definitely, for some, are information. And then, of course, there's family history. Having a direct relative with Alzheimer's or another form of dementia increases risk. And then, as we talked about earlier, race and ethnicity. Recent studies that I'll talk about towards the end of the program have showed us, however, that environmental and lifestyle factors, our cardiovascular health, the amount of physical activity we get, particularly starting in midlife, our diet, and our quantity and quality of sleep are being understood as new risk factors of developing dementia. This year, at our AAIC conference, the Alzheimer's Association International Conference on Research, A study was released that showed pretty significant connection between air pollution and dementia risk, which puts a very large population of the globe, of the world, at a higher risk of developing dementia due to air population. And then, of course, we have social and cognitive engagement as another risk factor that is modifiable. So the good news is there are things that we can change, interventions that we have control over that are being shown to potentially lower our risk of developing dementia. So I think that fits really nicely with the mission of the Healthy Aging Institute at CSU. Next slide, please. Oh, and then we, of course, have education and traumatic brain injury. Thank you, Wendy. This shows you a timeline of the available therapies since Dr. Alzheimer's discovered Alzheimer's disease in his patient's brain in 1906. Going back to what we know of as the hallmarks of disease, those plaques and tangles, it's important to understand that up until recently, with the introduction of aducanumab to the market, there has not been a disease-modifying pharmaceutical therapy that addresses the disease of Alzheimer's. Aricept, Exelon, Razidine, Namenda, and then a combination of Aricept and Namenda called Namzaric have been available at their associated years shown here. What these drugs do is they help treat or address symptoms associated with Alzheimer's disease, but they do not address the underlying disease pathology that we talked about earlier with those plaques and tangles. Similarly, the drugs shown here up until aducanumab, the drugs until 2014, or till recently rather, have had mild, if not no effect for a very short time of people taking them. So they weren't of much hope to people living with Alzheimer's, but for some, they did help control symptoms, or they still control symptoms for a year or so. In 2021, the FDA granted accelerated approval to aducanumab, going under the brand name Aduhelm. It is an intravenous or an injection therapy, and it is the first FDA-approved treatment that actually is shown to modify the amyloid plaques associated with Alzheimer's disease. The science that underlies this is that when we address plaques, we potentially could improve the likelihood that someone would not have cognitive decline. So it's not a complete cure, it's not a complete treatment, but it represents an advancement in the science that shows we now have an FDA-approved drug that at least addresses one of the hallmarks of Alzheimer's disease. After the program, I'll put in the chat a really nice visual image from our academic journal that shows the types of drugs and what part of the disease they are targeting that are in the clinical trials pipeline, so you can have a better perspective of where aducanumab may fit. Because again, it's not a cure, it's not a treatment, it simply represents an advancement in the science, whereas it is able to treat or address the amyloid plaques, and potentially someone can see a reduction in their cognitive decline. Next slide, please. I'll skip these two slides, Wendy. They're just to punctuate that the Alzheimer's Association is the world's largest nonprofit funder of Alzheimer's and dementia research. We're the third largest funder of Alzheimer's and dementia research after the United States and Chinese governments. So not only do we fund research studies, but the Alzheimer's Association also has a really large pool of volunteer and staff advocates who work with their state and federal legislators on on legislation that can benefit the lives of people living with dementia and their caregivers. Most importantly, it is because of our advocacy program that the NIH, the National Institute of Health, has been granted in 2022, they are expecting up to $3.4 billion in Alzheimer's and dementia research funding. So it's because of our advocacy program that we have seen this increase in national funding towards Alzheimer's and dementia. This increase is exciting because when you compare it to increases in research funding in diseases like cancer, HIV/AIDS, when you compare it to the trajectory of those diseases, when we see increased funding in research, we see a pretty significant advancement in the disease trajectory. So that's really exciting for us at the Alzheimer's Association. Next slide, please. So like I said, this is a really exciting time in Alzheimer's and dementia research. There are things that I can say today that I was not able to say just a few years ago associated with Alzheimer's and dementia. So it's certainly a really exciting time in the trajectory of this disease and what we know about dementia. Next slide, please. One of the common misnomers out there is that Alzheimer's disease cannot be diagnosed until after death. Biomarkers are really changing that game. Biomarkers are changing the game of early detection and diagnosis. Advancements in areas like brain imaging, biofluid analysis, and other emerging markers are giving scientists and then hopefully eventually clinicians the ability to more easily detect the presence of disease in the body where they would know the disease is present. Up until 2001, PET imaging wasn't able to detect Alzheimer's disease in the brain. And it was because of an Alzheimer's Association funded project at the University of Pittsburgh, where Dr. Bill Klunk discovered the process known today called amyloid PET imaging. So through PET images, amyloid plaques are present in the brain. However, it's important to note that Medicare does not yet cover amyloid PET imaging in the diagnostic process. So the Alzheimer's Association has started a number of studies under the umbrella term IDEAS study to study the effectiveness of using PET imaging in the diagnostic process and the effect on care outcomes, so that the association can take that data, take that new knowledge to Medicare and Medicaid services and advocate for the coverage of this scan in a diagnostic process. Biomarkers allow us, when we think of that continuum of disease, the continuum of dementia, to detect the presence of disease before either MCI or dementia symptoms even onset. So pretty exciting time in Alzheimer's disease research relating to early detection and diagnosis. I also want to note that in 2020, the FDA approved another imaging agent for clinical use that would target those tau tangles in the brain. So now we have, through PET imaging, two processes of being able to see plaques and tangles in the brain. You're probably wondering where MRI comes into the picture. MRIs are used in Alzheimer's diagnosis, but is more so to look at the change in brain structure, not to identify the presence of disease. Other tools that are being developed in the biomarker space involve cerebrospinal fluid tests, blood tests, eye tests, and even saliva. So the ability to detect disease easier would allow for better diagnostic rates. We still say at the Alzheimer's Association that half of people living with the disease are never diagnosed. Of the people who are diagnosed clinically, half of those people are never told their diagnosis. Dementia is likely noted in their medical record, but the physician has not yet disclosed that diagnosis with the patient and family. It's been said that it's because of the hopelessness around lack of treatment. We talked about up until the FDA accelerated approval of aducanumab, that those drugs didn't necessarily treat the disease. They simply address the symptoms. But we are really working towards better detection and diagnosis of disease and dementia so that people can know what to expect and so that families can be prepared for their loved ones' care. Next slide, please. So like I said, biomarkers are really changing and modernizing the diagnostic process. We're seeing that 20 years or more before dementia symptoms even occur, the disease is present in the brain. So through biomarker tests, it could give scientists, clinicians the ability to address the disease before dementia symptoms occur. So pretty exciting time in Alzheimer's disease research in that regard. Next slide, please. Next, I'm going to talk about the advancements toward more effective treatments and interventions. Next slide, please. Here you have the landscape of clinical trials for Alzheimer's and dementia drugs and devices as of April of 2021 this year. Phase 1 studies typically involve healthy volunteers, so volunteers without any form of Alzheimer's or another form of dementia, and they're typically relatively small in design, about 30 to 80 participants. The purpose of phase 1 studies are to understand the safety of an approach. Phase 2 trials typically involve healthy volunteers, but also may involve individuals living with the disease. And they're aimed at not only understanding the safety of approach, but may also start to address questions about whether or not the drug benefits those with the disease. Phase 3 trials typically involve only individuals with the disease and can involve upwards of thousands of volunteers. And they typically take longer to happen, 1.5 to 2 years on average in Alzheimer's clinical trials. You can see here that not all drugs move through the trajectory of the clinical trial process and pipeline, if you will. And as I said earlier, because of the health disparities we see in Alzheimer's disease and other dementias, it's important that not all participants in these trials are the same. There's an urgent need for more ethnic, racial, socioeconomic diversity in these trials so that the treatments that do move through this process are equitable in their approach. Next slide, please. The Alzheimer's Association has a program called Trial Match, and it is a clinical trials and clinical studies matching program. So it allows you to create a profile. So I have a profile in Trial Match, and it is available to healthy individuals, individuals of any age, of any disease status. And once someone creates their profile, it matches them with the trials and studies that they qualify for. So pretty exciting way to see, okay, if I want to help out as a healthy person in my 30s, but someone with Alzheimer's in my family history, I'm going to look at the trials that I qualify for and volunteer for them to advance the science. Similarly, if any scientists are on the line or are watching, this is a great place to make sure that your investigation is listed so that you can recruit participants for it. Next slide, please. It's important to note that the treatments in the clinical trials pipeline are not only addressing the disease of Alzheimer's or dementia to affect change in cognitive functioning related to memory, learning, thinking, and planning, but there are also studies being done to look at the behavioral and psychological symptoms such as depression, anxiety, delusions, hallucinations, apathy, agitation, and sleep disturbances that are associated with Alzheimer's disease and other forms of dementia. Antipsychotic medications that have been on the market for years often are improperly used in people with dementia and can create significant adverse side effects, such as falls. Recent data has shown that during the COVID-19 pandemic, and because of the staffing shortages that we're seeing in our long-term care communities, there's been a pretty significant increase in the use of antipsychotic drugs in elders with dementia. And again, I just want to punctuate that those can have pretty significant side effects. And so studies being done to treat these things that are appropriate for people with dementia are also important. Next slide, please. Many scientists are critical of the plaques and tangle philosophy of a way of understanding Alzheimer's disease. New research is showing us that the disease is much more complex than the plaques and tangles and the atrophy in the brain that Dr. Alzheimer's discovered in 1906. Therefore, it's believed that the complete treatment or the complete cure of Alzheimer's disease will be a really multifaceted approach addressing many different things. And so I'm going to talk about the Alzheimer's Association's Part the Cloud translational research program, which has given and distributed millions of dollars towards really kind of creative ways of thinking and new ways of thinking about Alzheimer's disease. Studies that may look at the role of mitochondria, which is the brain cell metabolism that produces energy in the brain, or the autophagy, which is basically the brain's trash can, and then vascular contributions that lead to neuroinflammation. Part the Cloud is the program that Bill Gates has gotten involved with because he was really one of the thought leaders that took the science past moving in a new direction of adding new ways of understanding Alzheimer's disease. Next slide, please. You may have heard of the Sprint Mind study that was released in the summer of 2018, which was the first study to actually demonstrate the reduction in new cases of cognitive impairment. So it was really the first time in this profession we were able to say there is an intervention someone can do to lower their risk, proven in evidence of developing dementia. The study looked at blood pressure, specifically the systolic number, and treating blood pressure pretty aggressively below that 120/80 as a clinical standard in older adults. So research is starting to suggest that taking really good care of your heart and your cardiovascular disease risk factors, but particularly blood pressure, can lower one's risk of developing cognitive impairment. Next slide, please. So like I said earlier, I've heard many top scientists and thought leaders in this field say that the complete prevention, the complete treatment, the complete cure of Alzheimer's disease and other forms of dementia, and the basic science behind brain health is going to really be an interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary approach. It's not only about those pharmaceutical approaches, but research is suggesting that combining multiple healthy factors and staying cognitively and socially engaged in later in life, getting enough physical activity, particularly starting in midlife, and eating a healthy diet, particularly the Mediterranean and the DASH diets, are starting to show that those could be successful interventions in potentially delaying the onset of dementia. So a really exciting time when we look at things that we can control even earlier in our life. Next slide, please. The US Pointer study is the Alzheimer's Association's large-scale clinical trial that is happening in many sites across the country. It has about 2,000 participants enrolled in it. That is looking at lifestyle interventions in a clinical study. So it's a 2-year, as I said, multi-center randomized clinical trial that is taking 60 to 79-year-olds with suboptimal lifestyles, so maybe not doing what they should, and having them remain socially engaged, doing cognitive exercises that are not only redundant, but challenging to them. So if someone can do a crossword puzzle in their sleep, doing a mathematical problem that would actually be more challenging to them. Eating the right diet and getting enough physical exercise. And if these interventions prove effective, this study will lead the way in the development of really an accessible and sustainable community-based program for prevention. So it's kind of like how we think about heart disease or having high cholesterol. Yes, there are statins available that lower cholesterol, but we have learned over the years that getting enough exercise and eating a really healthy diet can lower cholesterol as well. So it's a new way of understanding brain health and introducing our discussion of brain health into the discussion of the things we already talk about, like our heart health or our mental health or whatnot. Next slide, please. The NIA, or the National Institute on Aging, has additional supplemental studies or ancillary studies to support the work of the US Pointer study that the Alzheimer's Association is leading. There's pointer neuroimaging, so looking at, again, the effect of neuroimaging in the diagnostic process, pointer neurovascular, so looking at cardiovascular biomarkers and interventions like blood pressure, pointer Z or pointer sleep, looking at the quality and quantity of sleep people need, and then pointer microbiome, so I'm looking at the connection of gut health and gut bacteria to the brain. So pointer, along with these ancillary studies, will only advance what we know about dementia in older adults, but also will tell us from a lifespan perspective what people can do earlier to potentially lower their risk of developing dementia. Next slide, please. The US Pointer is actually modeled on a study that was done in Finland called the Finger Study, which stood for the Finnish Geriatric Intervention Study to Prevent Cognitive Impairment and Disability, which was done a handful of years ago and actually did show a reduction in cognitive decline in older adults who started to practice some of these healthy eating, exercise, social engagement practices. So it really gave us that old adage that it's never too late to start in our brain health discussion. And there's a number of other sites across the country that you can see here that are modeled off of the Finger study, like we are leading here in the US with the Pointer study. Next slide, please. So really what the Alzheimer's Association's goal is to truly change the trajectory of Alzheimer's disease. We recognize that people are currently living with Alzheimer's and currently living with dementia who need care, and we know we need to support those caregivers. But the Alzheimer's Association also acknowledges the financial cost, the emotional cost, the familial cost, the social cost of Alzheimer's disease that we talked about earlier that needs to be changed. I don't know that our nation can sustain the expected number of people living with Alzheimer's or dementia, given what's expected with the trajectory. So what the data shows us is that if a treatment is developed by 2025 that delays the onset of Alzheimer's by just 5 years, 5.7 million Americans expected to develop Alzheimer's in 2050 would not. So if we just slowed the course of the onset of disease by 5 years, we would almost prevent 6 million people from getting dementia in 2050, which is pretty exciting. Next slide, please. There's a neat app. It's called the Science Hub app that is free to download in your Apple or Google Play Store. Has everything related to Alzheimer's, dementia, and brain health research. So pretty kind of neat tool that if you're interested. Next slide, please. But in summary, the Alzheimer's Association is really proud to be the global leader in Alzheimer's and dementia science. So not only do we fund studies, but we advocate for research funding at the federal level. Similarly, we convene scientists from across the globe at our AAIC conferences, and that helps bridge the gap and share what was maybe proprietary knowledge with others so that discoveries can move possibly at a faster pace. And I know that there's hope in research. I know that everyone has been talking about aducanumab this year, and while it represents an exciting advancement in the science, I want to reiterate that it's not a complete treatment of the disease or a complete cure, but it does show the hope in the scientific process that is behind research. So next slide, please. Thank you so much for having me. Again, I will post something in the chat. And Wendy, thank you for being my slide advancer. And I think we have time for questions. So thank you everyone so much for hosting this program today.
Thank you so much, Kelly. That was great. Couple questions for you. Are there any proven effective supplements that strengthen or maintain memory?
This is always a common question. With Alzheimer's disease, dementia, and memory, if it sounds too good to be true, it is. So there are people who want older adults particularly to believe that things like coconut oil, fish oil, vitamin D, that taking a supplement will just fix someone's memory issues. And unfortunately, at this point, it's too good to be true. You likely have seen commercials of Prevagen. Prevagen is over-the-counter supplement pill that claims to repair memory in older adults. And when you look at the studies that were done behind Prevagen, they really weren't as scientifically rigorous as the Alzheimer's Association likes to see. And similarly, the large majority of participants in those studies were otherwise quite healthy. And they didn't control for factors like physical exercise or even the placebo effect in self-reporting to know that Prevagen was effective. So be a savvy consumer. If it sounds too good to be true, it is. And I have heard both a physician and a pharmacist say, instead of paying the $60, $80 a month for Prevagen, invest in a gym membership and buy a few more leafy green vegetables. And that those will actually have been proven in the science to have more effect on the brain than any supplement or Prevagen. Trust me, if it was easy, I would be doing it. So unfortunately, that's too good to be true.
That goes quite well into our next question. Can you comment on the body of knowledge surrounding how lifelong habits of regular exercise can prevent dementia, even though some of the physical changes within the brain associated with dementia and Alzheimer's are present?
Yeah, that's a great question. So two studies that I'm thinking of. The study that you definitely want to look at is the data from the the FINGER study. The FINGER study a few years ago took a pretty large group of people in Finland and had them who were otherwise performing subpar in their health habits and had them start getting, I think it was 120 minutes of rigorous physical exercise a week, eating the Mediterranean diet, and staying socially and cognitively engaged. What I don't remember is if the finger study had a neuroimaging component to it, so I can't speak to whether or not it looked at disease presence in the brain. Statistically, it's likely that there could have been some, but I don't know that they confirmed with neuroimaging. And then there's other studies that show from a risk perspective when risk factors start to matter in brain health. So for example, brain injury or head injury or traumatic brain injury is one of the earliest modifiable risk factors that brain injury in childhood and preventing brain injury in childhood can affect later life. And that's where that information around the importance of exercise in midlife comes from. So I can certainly find those two studies and link them for you. And then, is there a genetic risk for developing vascular dementia? That's a great question. I'm not as familiar with vascular dementia. I'm going to hesitate in answering that question, but from the understanding of vascular dementia being often caused by stroke or heart-brain dysfunction, the science is showing us that preventing stroke and preventing heart attacks and keeping cholesterol and blood pressure low, that we actually are likely to see lower rates of vascular dementia. And I can find something on that as well. These are great questions.
That'd be great. And we can put those links to the studies in the recording email that we send out.
Absolutely.
And if there's no more questions, I can go ahead and close out with a few announcements. So our next speaker series is going to be Wednesday, November 10th. We're going to be featuring our director, Dr. Nicole Earhart, and her talk that's titled SARS-CoV-2 and Long-Term Care Facilities, Trying to Turn the Titanic. It talks about our project to prevent spread in the long-term care facilities with more frequent testing. We will also be having our October Healthy Aging Fitness group right after this meeting at 1 o'clock. If you'd like to join us, Hannah just put the registration link in the chat, and you're welcome to go ahead and sign up. It's going to be a low impact workout and should be a lot of fun. And then our next big event is the last installment of our Aging Across the Lifespan series. This one's focusing on age 65 and up. And it's happening this coming Tuesday, the 26th at 12 o'clock. You're welcome to reach out with any questions and to register. Oh, and we have a last minute question for you, Kelly. What lifestyle changes have you made or are you making in your life based on your knowledge?
That's a great question. I think that though I'm not perfectly compliant, and the pandemic has made me even more so out of compliant, eating the Mediterranean diet 90% of the time, and getting at least 120 minutes a week of rigorous physical exercise are two things that I know I should be doing. Getting 8 hours of sleep a night, and then also managing any symptoms of depression. And we didn't talk a lot about the link between depression and Alzheimer's, but there is new knowledge there as well. Great question. And I posted for who asked in Nearheart, I posted two studies, the finger study and then the cardiovascular fitness and dementia and midlife in the chat. So thank you, everyone.